Time will begin on my first word. I affirm resolve the United States ought to adopt the wealth tax. My value is justice defined as fairness. My value criterion is mitigating structural oppression. Structural oppression is the tendencies of institutions to promote hierarchies, creating power disparities in which those with power are left to abuse those without it unimpeded. Those without power cannot pursue goals or ends, and ultimately their values as humans and the dues they are owed aren't respected. Prefer this framework for 3 reasons. First, structural oppression is inherently unjust since it involves the denial of dues to some. Second, addressing structural oppression is a prerequisite for political justice. If unjust structures aren't dealt with, then even if the immediate state of the world changes, more injustice will continue to occur. Third, it is the most directly applicable value criterion. Governments can only change large-scale structures, not the people themselves. Observation. As Congress has debated a multitude of wealth tax proposals, and there is no one plan that stands out as broadly supported, the burden of the affirmative is simply to consider the wealth tax as a general hypothetical rather than a specific policy proposal. Contention 1. Unproductive capital. A wealth tax completely changes the U.S.'s economic playing field through changing who gains more power. Smith 16. When you discourage useful economic activity, the economy becomes less efficient. Lots of people have wealth but aren't able to use it effectively. The U.S. tax system accommodates these people with a variety of breaks. If they lose on their investments, they get tax write-offs. The net effect of this system is to allocate more of society's capital to the people who are least able to put it to good use. If the U.S. replaced capital taxation with a tax on wealth itself, the effect is reversed. The distribution of wealth shifts to society's most productive entrepreneurs and investors, and growth goes up as a result. Furthermore, a research paper by Gonda 19 did an in-depth simulation on the effects of wealth tax implementation on U.S. society, corroborating the findings of Smith 16, explaining that under income taxation, entrepreneurs who are more productive pay higher taxes. That wealth taxation shifts the tax burden towards unproductive entrepreneurs. This reallocation increases aggregate productivity and output. In the simulated model, the income tax delivers lower welfare gains than the wealth tax. We conclude that wealth taxation has the potential to raise productivity while simultaneously reducing consumption inequality. A wealth tax will gradually prune the wealth of idle entrepreneurs and boost that of successful ones, leading to a more efficient allocation of the aggregate capital stock, in turn raising productivity and output. In this sense, wealth taxation has a use it or lose it effect that is not present in income taxation. Thus, both Gonda and Smith effectively illustrate the uniqueness of a wealth tax to not only raise productivity, but also boost the economic status of America. Reach 24 explains that in the status quo, wealth concentrates power into the hands of fewer and fewer people who can choose what to support and which politicians to bankroll. This gives an unelected elite enormous sway over both our economy and our democracy, which leads to 2 main impacts. First, a wealth tax allows the government to morally raise those who are productive members of society by establishing a clear selection process. Individuals who influence American societies are now the ones that are most interested in providing and supporting economic growth, which is inherently most beneficial to the oppressed. Second, the act of hoarding excessive amounts of money is a structural oppression, as it leads to consequences that only embolden the power of the rich, while weakening the power of the structurally marginalized by having money that doesn't stimulate the economy or lead to growth. Contention 2, wealth disparities. Ken 24 described the degree of wealth disparities in the U.S. in 2024, stating that the top 10% of households by wealth had 6.7 million on average. They held 66.9% of total household wealth. The bottom 50% of households had 50,000 on average. They held only 2.5% of total household wealth. The wealthy have been reigning for years, unbothered by those suffering in poverty, and it's time for that to change. The best and most feasible avenue to do so is through the wealth tax. PGP23 explains, most economists agree that the tax system is a useful vehicle for addressing the nation's income and wealth inequality. A wealth tax effectively helps to balance out the increasing gap between the richest and the poorest in America through a multitude of ways to help structurally oppressed Americans. Collins 21 elaborates on this point by illustrating how wealth tax can be a solution. He states, an annual wealth tax could solve a number of festering problems. And Gonda 19 adds on that by stating a tax system with wealth taxation improves average welfare for every cohort. The higher revenue generated by the wealth tax allows the government to substantially reduce the tax rate on labor. This leads to 2 impacts. First, labor taxes in the status quo decrease wages and employment for individuals. As Wilson 22 states, taxes on labor income and consumption spending encourage households to shift away from work. Higher tax rates on labor income and consumption expenditures lead to less work time and employment in industries that rely heavily on low-wage, low-skilled labor inputs. Buffy 22 adds that structurally oppressed minorities are uplifted with a lower tax rate on labor, stating low-income Americans face higher payroll taxes than rich Americans. Americans with less than 5-figure incomes pay an effective payroll tax rate of 14.1%, while those making 7-figure incomes pay just 1.9%. Long-term capital gains are taxed at lower preferential rates, overwhelmingly accrue to the rich. With a reduction in labor tax, the poorest who are kept in cyclical poverty with high labor tax rates will have an opportunity to escape and reap the economic benefits of their hard work. Second, CFR 22 analyzes the impact of wealth inequality on U.S. citizens, stating that inequality is a drag on economic growth and fosters political dysfunction. Concentrated income and wealth reduces the level of demand in the economy because rich households tend to spend less of their income than poor ones. Recent years have seen the election of populist leaders, which researchers have linked to insecurity caused by economic inequality. Wealthy people can exert outsized influence on the government by financing political campaigns. Rising inequalities eroding trust in democratic society and fostering the spread of authoritarianism. Reducing the wealth inequality gap not only is able to stimulate economic growth, like how unproductive capital tax by the wealth tax can, but is also capable of preventing the rise of more authoritative leaders that only serve the rich. Thus, I affirm.
Awesome. If everybody's ready, I'll begin 3-minute cross-X starting now. All right, let's start off on your framework with your value criterion of minimizing structural violence. How do we define a structure in this context?
I think a structure is anything like a societal norm or perspective, some type of large-scale view or government that is perpetuating some type of discriminatory behavior or perpetuating some stereotype that is oppressing a certain group.
Okay, thank you. So, is there violence and oppression in society aside from these structures?
I think that the only source of violence and oppression in society stems from things like structures. That is why we have to mitigate them.
Awesome, thank you. We'll move down to your contention about unproductive capital.
Sure.
So first you give Smith 16 to say that the wealthy aren't able to use all of their wealth. So how does it...
Sorry, that's not what Smith 16 is saying. Smith 16 is saying is that when you have a wealth tax, that changes the economic skew of who's in power and who's not, so that those who are actually productive are now more in power. It's not a matter of whether the wealthy use their wealth.
Okay, how does it change the economic skew of who's in power?
Yeah, so right now, in the status quo, the wealthy have no reason to use their wealth because they're accommodated for it. They have things like tax breaks. But when you have a wealth tax, when you actually have a consequence to not using your wealth in the first place, that's obviously going to motivate you to do something about that. And what you're going to do is use things like strategic investments and gain more.
Just because they're doing things like strategic investments and trying to invest in productive things, how does that shift the balance of who's in power? Wouldn't they still just have wealth?
Well, yeah, but when you have the wealth, because the power right now, as I tell you in my Reach 24 evidence, power is determined by wealth. If you have people who are more wealthy, who are people who invest more, who are making more money, not be taxed at higher rates like they are in the status quo, then they're eventually going to rise to the top. That means they're going to get the most power. They're going to control and stimulate more economic growth. Because that's
Thank you. But how does incentivizing the wealthy to invest more give the lower classes more power?
Yeah, so I think when you have a more productive economy, the main people it affects are those who are structurally oppressed. Because oftentimes, they're the ones left with the lower incomes. They're the ones left with low wages, wage exploitation, things like that. They're the ones being affected the most. And so when we stimulate a more productive economy, they're also the ones who are benefiting the most.
Okay, sure, that's fine. Move down to your contention too about disparities then.
Sure.
So could you just briefly summarize how a wealth tax minimizes disparities?
Yeah, so I think a wealth tax minimizes disparities in two main ways. The first of which is the fact that the basic implementation of a wealth tax allows the government to take some burden off of a labor income tax, which effectively helps those who are marginalized, those who are oppressed.
Okay, we'll go over the second reason in a second. But could you explain to me what part of the resolution says that we would be lowering labor taxes or income taxes?
Yeah, so if you listen to what I just said, that a wealth tax specifically, when you implement a wealth tax, the revenue got from wealth tax, just by the act of taxing the rich, is able to take some burden off of the government so that they can relieve some of the labor income tax. That's how wealth tax impacts labor income tax.
Okay, what's the second way that we solve for inequality?
Yeah, so the second way that we solve for inequality is because we prevent things like radicalization, where can I finish? Is that fine? Yeah. Okay, we encourage leaders to come into power who only benefit the rich, and that's because the rich are the only people gaining power in the status quo.
Awesome. I'll take 4 minutes running prep starting now. All right, that's all the prep time will take. I've got a minute 23 remaining. The order for this speech will be reading the NC and then going over the AC. If everyone's ready, I'll begin 7 minutes starting now. I negate. First, I offer the definition according to Cambridge Dictionary that a wealth tax is a tax on personal property and financial assets above a particular level. I agree with my opponent's framework because they tell you in cross that all violence is the result of structural violence, which means we're overall trying to minimize net harms. Now, moving on to my contention one, which is politics. A wealth tax massively increases the political influence and incentive for political donations by the ultra-wealthy. Smith 20, quote, if a wealth tax jeopardizes executives, they retain more incentive to influence government policy. Most donations by the super wealthy are to non-political causes, but by politicizing wealth itself, a wealth tax would encourage billionaires to enter the political process against it. Far from pushing the wealthy out of politics, a wealth tax draws them in, end quote. It causes the super rich to further their support of extreme right-wing candidates as they are the most likely to cut or repeal the tax. This support allows furtherance of an extremist agenda that would devastate society. Pro-COP24, quote, the movement's policy recommendations include to zero out federal funding to low-income schools, unleash oil and natural gas production, roll back various environmental regulations, majorly cut Medicaid, and revoke FDA approval of abortion pills, end quote. Contention 2, revenue. A wealth tax is counterproductive in even achieving its own goals. It causes even less revenue to be raised than in the status quo, which hurts society. That happens for 2 reasons. First, a wealth tax incentivizes the ultra-wealthy to move overseas in a process called capital flight, dragging taxable wealth out of the country. The impacts have already been seen in Norway. Even with a moderate wealth tax, it decimated revenue. Millet Moore 23, quote, more than 30 Norwegian billionaires and multimillionaires left in 2022, more than the total number of super rich people who left during the previous 13 years combined. The increased wealth tax to 1.1% and capital flight left the Norwegian government with 40% less revenue, end quote. And second, even when the ultra-wealthy don't leave the country, they dramatically increase tax evasion by hiding assets and underreporting, which lowers overall revenue and welfare. Empirics prove. Rodberg and Steinberg 24, quote, after accounting for evasion, tax revenue would fall, inequality would increase, and widespread welfare losses would result. Taxes on wealth increase the benefits of evasion and lead to large welfare losses concentrated in households at the bottom of the wealth distribution. Findings suggest that even substantially increasing enforcement would not be sufficient for higher taxes on wealth to be successful, end quote. Contention 3, investment. A wealth tax kills investment in 2 key areas, which plunges economic growth. First, a U.S. wealth tax minimizes innovation. It eliminates incentives to invest in startups while forcing new companies to be sold prematurely because they lack the liquidity to pay a wealth tax. Schrager and Akers 20, quote, wealth taxes reduce the return on investing and discourage savings, reducing growth because investing and capital accumulation are key to innovation. Non-liquid liability would force some to sell equity earlier, which dilutes investment, innovation, and job creation, end quote. And second, a wealth tax discourages investment from foreign individuals and corporations, which deprives rural communities of jobs. Lonsdale 20, quote, imposing a wealth tax would make the U.S. less attractive to foreign investors and wealthy immigrants with real consequences for the economy. In 2018, foreign direct investment totaled $296 billion and 7.4 million jobs disproportionately in rural America, end quote. But now, let's move on to my opponent's side of the flow. Again, just to reiterate framework, since they tell you in cross that all violence is a result of structural violence, and we want to overall reduce violence and oppression in society, we're just going to be looking to overall minimizing suffering and violence within society. Now, moving on to my opponent's contention 1 about unproductive capital, there's going to be 5 key responses to note here. First, see that we actually make the economy overall worse and less productive. You can cross-apply our contention 3 for this. And it shows you specifically that by discouraging saving and capital accumulation, we directly harm innovation, in addition to forcing companies to be sold earlier because they just don't have the liquid assets necessary to pay a wealth tax, both of which directly harms economic growth and productivity. The trend that my opponent talks about of trying to discourage saving is actually harmful, while they're trying to tell you it's not. Second, see that they don't give you any link to redistributing power. They say that we're encouraging the wealthy to invest more, we're encouraging them to go to productive assets, but even if that were true, they don't show how the wealthy having more productive assets and more investments is actually helpful to society or actually redistributes the power. Third, you're going to look to Wolf 20, which evaluates the effects of both a Swiss-style wealth tax and a Warren-style wealth tax in the U.S., while using the Gini coefficient to measure wealth inequality, and finds that overall there is no substantial drop in wealth inequality with either wealth tax, which means that which is another reason why we're not able to substantially redistribute wealth or power. Fourth, you can cross-apply our contention 2 here, that we're not raising substantial enough revenues. We're actually raising less revenue in their world than in ours, and that's harmful because by raising less revenue, there's actually less programs to uplift the least well-off in society and redistribute the power and the wealth like my opponent talks about. Fifth, you're going to look to CDC2024 which tells you that a wealth tax is not enforceable because it's hard to find accurate valuations of different assets. Things like paintings and yachts don't have an easy way to determine exactly what they're worth, and by having an annual wealth tax forcing these appraisals every single year, a wealth tax is simply not enforceable. So even if everything they said before was true, we can't see the impacts of a wealth tax because it's not enforceable. But then let's move down to their contention 2 about disparities, where there's 6 key responses. First, cross-apply Wolf 20 from before. There's not a substantial drop in inequality, which is empirically proven. You're going to prefer that to any of these general arguments that my opponent gives you about, oh, a wealth tax might solve, but we give you an actual empirical study. Second, again, cross-apply our contention 2, we see less revenue in the affirmative world because of capital flight and because of tax evasion. Remember, even when we account for the effects of increased enforcement, we still see a net negative effect because of tax evasion. That means even if wealth was going to the right programs, we see less revenue to begin with. But third, see that we can't guarantee that wealth is going to programs to help the least well-off. Wealth could just as easily be going to something like military spending. Fourth, see that even if it does go to welfare programs, it's not necessarily the right welfare programs. They try to tell you that we're taking wealth away from the top, and that's sufficient to help inequality. But just taking money from the rich isn't going to help the people who are poor. We need to actually be giving them money, but they can't guarantee that we are giving them money or funding any welfare programs. Fifth, see that even in a world where there's complete wealth redistribution, they fail to solve the underlying structural issues. That's Sharma 17 finds that even if we redistribute all wealth, we see actually a negligible impact of poverty and inequality in the long term because of these structural issues. And sixth, they talk about labor taxes and wanting to reduce labor taxes, but see the resolution doesn't talk about reducing labor taxes. They say it would allow the government to, but that's not part of the resolution. That's not part of either world. Don't weigh this impact about reduced labor taxes. For all these reasons, you're going to negate. Thank you.
Everyone's ready? Time will begin on my first. Okay, so let's go on to the value criterion. So you say that I just conflate to minimizing suffering. Can you just specifically point out where in my warranting of that, my mitigating structural oppression, do I say that to mitigate structural oppression we have to just look to general society? Just point that out.
Okay, well what you say is we want to minimize structural violence, but then in cross you say all violence is the result of structural violence. So assuming both of those to be true, we're trying to minimize overall violence because overall violence is always the result of structural violence.
So
what you tell me in cross.
Let me ask you this. Who is the structural violence impacting? Who is that impacting?
The structural violence is affecting whoever is harmed by the structure.
Right.
It's not always going to be a certain
And those who are harmed are structurally oppressed. So we have to look to helping those who are structurally oppressed. How does that make it so that we have to look to everyone?
Well, you say all oppression is the result of structural oppression. So whenever there is oppression or suffering, we should try to minimize that.
Okay, so we're both agreeing that we have to look to helping those who are structurally oppressed.
We try to minimize overall oppression because it's a result of structural oppression, like you tell me, but we're not looking to one specific group.
Okay, I'll bring that up here. Let's move on to your negative constructed. So you talk about specifically on your contention of revenue, specifically can you just reiterate your first point about how revenue
So
go down?
the first point is capital flight, which is people are willing to go overseas, they're willing to leave the US to avoid a wealth tax like we saw in Norway.
Okay, and so is Norway the best historical example that you think is present?
It's by far the best and the clearest historical example. It might not be exactly the same as the US, but it's your burden to prove why we can't look at Norway.
So basically you're saying everything that's happening in Norway is going to also be demonstrated in
Not everything that's happening in Norway, but it's comparable enough to generate, to indicate an overall trend.
Okay, that's fine. Let's move on to your second point about tax evasion.
Yeah.
I just want to reiterate, so your Rothberg and Steinberg evidence, that's talking about an analysis done of years of analysis on how the wealthy have evaded taxes, right?
It's a meta-analysis on a wealth tax.
Okay, that's great.
They use a model with a wealth tax, one without.
Right.
They find that a wealth tax is not harmful.
Right. Okay. Sure. Let's move on to your contention 3 of investments. Can you just summarize this contention in one sentence?
So there's two ways that we harm investment. We harm innovation because companies can't pay a wealth tax initially because they don't have the liquidity and because people have less of an incentive to invest in startups. And then we also harm foreign direct investment because foreign individuals have less of an incentive to invest in the US, which harms job growth.
And then you talk specifically about how you're going to have like a decrease in foreign investment. So why are we going to have a decrease in foreign investment?
Yeah, so there's less of an incentive for people to invest in the US because the wealth tax is taxing US assets as well. So people are going to get less of a return on investment by investing in the US and reduce foreign investment.
So insofar as assets will increase, you're saying foreign investments will also increase?
My point is that when we are taxing assets, foreign investment will decrease.
Okay.
You would have to prove that there's a net positive on the return on investment specifically.
Okay. Before I start prep time, can I please see Smith 20, and then can I also see Wolf 20?
Yeah. Okay. You just want me to go to the first part that I cut from?
Yeah, that'd be great. And then judges, I'll start prep time once I start reading the first of it.
This first tab is the Smith 20 evidence. This is the first part, but I cut from all of it. And then the second tab is the Smith 20 evidence. This is mostly where I cut from, but I do cut from multiple parts.
Okay. Judges, I'm going to start prep time now. Okay. Okay, I'm assuming. Sorry, one sec. Alright, I'm resuming prep time at 3:48 right now. 130 per pound. As a brief off-term roadmap, I'm just going to be going over framework, and then we'll be going at neck. Anyone not ready? Time will begin on my first word. Firstly, starting on framework, my opponent just tries to conflate like mitigating structural oppression and minimizing suffering. They're not the same thing. If you're just minimizing suffering, then it's morally arbitrary who you're looking to. We have to have reason behind why we're specifically uplifting others, and moreover than that, they don't respond to any of my warning about who we're actually supposed to help. Remember, I tell you, mitigating structural oppression is helping those who are left without power in the status quo. Insofar as they say we're agreeing to that, they're agreeing to helping those who are structurally oppressed. We're looking to that at the value criterion. Don't let them misguide you into what we're actually looking to. Let's move down the flow. First of all, on contention one, first of all, as an overview, whenever they respond with Wolf 20, first of all, that Gini coefficient is talking about income distribution, not about wealth distribution. So you can't let my opponent tell you that Wolf 20 is showing no inequality distribution, because that's a representative of income, not about wealth. But then second, just a few paragraphs above that, it tells you specifically that while inequality might not be changed specifically, there's impacts on economic investments, and you can see increase in economic investments. So cross-apply that to anything they say about like decreased assets, decreasing liquidity. Their own card says that economic investments are going to go up. So that's against Wolf 20. But then, let's go on to the part specifically about economies getting worse because of like companies selling things early. That's the illiquidity part. You look to Young 82, which tells you specifically that illiquid assets being sold are not necessarily bad things. Sometimes it can increase economic efficiency. But then they tell you that there's no link to actually the distribution of power. Judge, I give you Reach 24, which tells you specifically that wealth describes power. Wealth defines power. If you have more wealth, you're going to get more power. And I tell you that when more productive people are going to rise to the top, they're going to get more power. That's your link. Then go on to the fact that they just cross-apply their contention to. Anytime they cross-apply, we'll get to their side. And finally, on FC23 about how we can't actually evaluate stuff, Judge, we have things like property inheritance taxes right now. Those are being battled in court. We have found ways to evaluate those. We can find ways to evaluate wealth taxes. And even if for the short term, we do have problems with that, in the long term, we can outweigh because the impacts are more significant. Then that means that you can clearly extend both my impacts. First, that we're morally raising those who are more productive. That means we're helping increase things like assets. We're helping increase the economy. But then second, to completely drop my opponent. On a deontological level, having hoarding wealth is a structural oppression. Insofar as my opponent drops that, that's on a higher plane. You can't let them respond to that. That's a clear reason that it's a really clear affirmative ballot. But then, let's move on to the contention 2. First of all, they just do Wolf 20 cross-apply. We'll get to that. We already addressed that. 3, they say there's no guarantee that we're actually going to distribute the wealth. Judge, my contention doesn't rely on us distributing the wealth. All it relies on is us just implementing the wealth tax in the first place. Remember, I tell you that if a wealth tax is implemented, we're going to see things like labor taxes be decreased. That's just meant on a wealth tax being implemented. My opponent says that's not part of the resolution. Judge, it's an effect of the resolution. Just on my opponent saying political radicalism is an effect of the resolution, I'm saying an effect of the resolution being implemented is that you're going to see labor taxes going down. But then, my opponent said that it's not the right welfare program. That's just not what I'm talking about. It's not significant. And then finally, the Sherman 17 evidence about poverty, Judge, they don't solve poverty either. That's something that neither of us can solve. I'm saying who can mitigate it the most. That means you can clearly extend both my impacts. The first, that labor taxes are going to decrease. Remember, they have no actual response to this. More significantly, you're going to have an increase in radicalism. You're going to have an increase in the power of those who only want to uplift the rich. You're going to cross-apply that to first their contention 1 of politics. But with that, let's move on to their contention 1 of politics specifically. You looked at 3 responses here. First, Matthew 16, which tells you that money doesn't actually influence elections at all. They tell you specifically that it's used for outright bribery, and when it is, it's only used to finance low-level issues like subsidies for farmers. So it isn't even used for these things like Medicare. Second, you looked at the fact that lobbying isn't even useful, like my opponent talks about lobbying. Lobbying isn't that useful either. Matthew 16 corroborates this. Finally, looked at the fact it's non-unique. Bradner 24 tells you politics are already shifting to far right. Then, on the tax evasion part, firstly, on tax haven usage and like capital flight. Firstly, Norway is not a good example. In Norway, you don't get taxed at a certain period of time. In the US, you do. Second, the IRS just recently did a new policy on tax evasion to help prevent it further. And third of all, you look to the fact that tax haven usage has been decreasing recently. And then you look to the fact on the third contention of investments. Firstly, we responded that with the illiquidity point. And second, on decrease in foreign investment. Remember, we showed you the economic investments go up. That means we counter that point effectively. It's a really clear affirmative ballot.
Awesome. I've got 123 of prep remaining, and I'll run that starting now. time there. The order will be briefly on framework, then the NC, then the AC. Is everybody ready? Awesome. I'll begin 6 minutes starting now. So briefly on framing, he says that I'm the one that's trying to conflate overall violence with structural violence, but look to what he said in Cross, that all violence is the result of structural violence. He's the one that conflates that originally when I asked him this question. But second, even if you didn't buy that, we'll show you that we're actually better able to weigh under their framework, even if you buy that we should only look to certain groups. But then let's move on to the negative side of the flow, starting off with contention one about politics, where we show you that a wealth tax increases lobbying and support for the extremist right because it gives them more of an incentive to donate to these campaigns because they want to get this wealth tax repealed. What my opponent says is that money doesn't affect elections, but the problem with their argument is that I'm not just talking about elections, I'm talking about lobbying government officials in general. Sometimes that affects elections, sometimes that's just getting policymakers to lobby for more extreme right agendas. Then they tell you that politics are already shifted right, but unless they can prove to you that politics are literally as far extreme as you can possibly go, it can get worse. That's the point of the negative. And then that's our first key voting issue in today's debate round, which is the idea of an extremist agenda. They don't sufficiently respond to our warranting. They don't prove why the wealthy wouldn't have an incentive to lobby more. They don't prove that the incentive would have, they don't prove that the wealthy would have sufficiently less money so that they couldn't lobby more. They don't prove that there isn't an impact, whereas we prove specifically that there is, specifically that we're leading to things like defunding schools, rolling back environmental and climate change regulations, and cutting things like Medicare. But then on contention 2 about revenue, he says that Norway's a bad example. And the reason why he says this is because he says you're considered a non-resident after you leave Norway for long enough. But this ignores the fact that Norway's wealth tax specifically taxes both residents and non-residents. Cross this off your flow, and then you're going to extend this point of capital flight because we give you the warranting that billionaires and millionaires are going to want to leave so that they pay less taxes. We give you the example of Norway where revenue fell by 40%. They can't prove to you why Norway doesn't apply to the US. Their one attack for this falls flat. Then you're also going to flow through this point about tax evasion, how the wealthy have more of an incentive to evade taxes, and how an empirical meta-analysis shows that there is in fact a net negative impact on revenue and on welfare. They say the IRS can help address tax evasion, but Rothberg and Steinberg 24 specifically find that even when you try to give more money to the IRS, even when you account for increased enforcement, there's still this net negative effect. Don't let them try to extend this point. Then on contention 3 of investment, they say that they responded to the illiquidity point, but they don't ever really explain their warranting for it. What you see is that we force businesses in the affirmative world to pay a wealth tax when they don't actually have the liquid assets to do so, which harms innovation. We also show that when we discourage savings and we reduce the return on investment, that also harms innovation. These warrantings aren't really sufficiently responded to. You can flow this through. Then they talk about then on foreign investment, see that we give wealthy immigrants and wealthy foreigners less of an incentive to invest in the US because it gives them less of a return on investment. They say they prove how that increases, but never do they tell you how there is more of a return on investment for a foreign individual investing on the US. They can never prove this to you. So this warranting flows through. You're also going to flow through the impact about millions of jobs put at risk. And that is our second key voting issue, the idea of investment, because they don't sufficiently respond to our points here. It's going to be a clean place to vote because we saved millions and millions of jobs. But then, let's move on to my opponent's side of the flow. Starting off with their overview on Wolf 20, they say the Gini coefficient doesn't apply to wealth, and while it's true that it usually looks at income inequality, it can also be applied to other things, and Wolf 20 specifically applies the Gini coefficient to net worth. It says that in the card. Then they talk about how Wolf 20 says there's an increase in innovation, but this is straight up misconstruing the card. It never once in Wolf 20 says innovation. The only positive economic benefit that it argues for is an increase in revenue, but insofar as we've already proven that there is a decline in revenue in the affirmative world because of tax evasion and capital flight, you can cross this point off your flow as well. But then let's move on to contention 1 about unproductive capital. So what we agree on is that there is more of an incentive for the wealthy to just spend their money, and there is less of an incentive for them to save it. What we disagree on is the impacts. You're going to look to Schreiger and Akers 20 that shows you that when we discourage saving, we actually harm innovation because innovation is reliant on accumulating wealth and on saving money. That's not a point that my opponent responds to. So even if you buy their warranting, you're going to turn their impact here. And then they try to talk about this redistributing of wealth and redistributing of power, but you're going to see that relies more on their contention too about the idea of redistributing power. They can't prove that the wealthy investing more and the wealthy getting more investments and more productive investments helps redistribute power. All it's going to do if you buy that they're investing more is give them more money. It's not going to help redistribute power to favor the poor. But then let's move on to their contention too about wealth disparities. So you're going to see, again, you're going to look at Wolf 20, which tells you that we don't reduce wealth disparities, and I've already defended that that's both applicable and that there's not a net positive economic impact. And then they try to tell you that it's not significant whether we're actually giving it to the right programs, because we actually care about breaking up wealth concentration at the top. But what you're going to see is that it actually is significant, because just taking money away from wealthy people isn't going to help inequality. It's not going to help poverty. What's going to help is if we actually have programs to uplift people. But the affirmative world doesn't prove that we get that, whereas the negative world proves that we have less revenue, and specifically we have welfare losses. And then they talk about this idea of labor taxes again. See that labor taxes could be implemented in either world. Cuts on labor taxes are non-unique. Don't let them try to tell you that it's unique to the affirmative. Even if it gives the government more leverage to implement a labor tax cut, they can't prove that the government would do that. So you're going to cross this impact off your flow. And that's the third key voting issue, the idea of the affirmative case. Because we show that there's less tax revenue overall, which means that they can't solve their impacts. We also show empirically that there's no impact on inequality, which means they also can't solve their impacts. And we show how there's actually less investment. For all these reasons, we urge you to negate. Thank you.
Okay, can I just see that Wolf 20 evidence?
Yeah.
And then I'll start there.
Do you want any specific part of it?
No, that's fine. Just where it was last time.
Okay.
I'll start my prep time. Prep time. Brief off-term roadmap. We're going to be touching on framework. Then I'm just going to be making a few key extensions first on the neg and the at, and then we're just going to be going straight into key voting issues. Is everyone ready? Okay. Time will begin on my first one. Firstly, starting on the framework, my opponent again tries to misguide you into what mitigating structural oppression really means. Mitigating structural oppression, inherently, if you agree to my definition, that means that you're focusing on those who don't have power in our current society. But again, they don't even touch the warrants, and the reason they don't touch the warrants is because they don't know that mitigating structural oppression is not the same as minimizing suffering. Mitigating structural oppression, remember, it's inherently unjust because it involves the denial of dues to some. That's why we prefer mitigating structural oppression. Moreover, my opponent doesn't even respond to the fact that I tell you minimizing suffering is morally arbitrary. We don't have a reason why we prefer some over others. We're looking to a clear reason about that. That's why we prefer mitigating structural oppression. With that in mind, remember that all my opponent's impacts have to outweigh with mitigating structural oppression in mind. With that, let's move on to the contention one of politics. First of all, on this contention of politics, even if you buy it like on a baseline level, they don't impact it out to mitigating structural oppression at all. Like they don't really show you. But even if you want to believe it, you can extend my point about cross-applying my second impact on my contention too. When you're going to see an increase of radicalism in when you have a wealth tax, because you're going to see those who only prefer the rich rise to the top. That goes unresponded to throughout both speeches. That's a really easy way you can not vote off of that. So they get nothing off of that. But then, let's move on to the contention too. My opponent tells you that Norway's wealth tax residents even when they're out of the country. That's not true. I can give you the card. It specifically says after 5 years of leaving the country, a wealth tax does not apply to you. And that's not the same. And that means that you're not going to be able to conflate a Norway example with the US example. I'd be happy to show you that. But second, you look to the fact that I gave you this IRS evidence. My opponent says this Rotberg and Steinberg evidence like counters it, but Judge, this Rotberg and Steinberg evidence talked about meta-analysis of past year's data. The IRS's new Inflation Reduction Act gave them $1 billion to jumpstart a new wave of tracking down billionaires who have evaded tax. So insofar as they can't give you a report post dating July 11th of 2024, like I said, they can't give you any evidence that now with the new IRS's tax reports and tax ways of tracking down the wealthy, that it's still going to be ineffective. That's going to be cleanly extended through. That means that none of their points, none of their Wolf 20 points, none of their simulations actually count for this new change in the IRS. They don't say why we still have to value them. And so that means they don't get anything off of that. But then finally, on their contention theory of investments, first of all, I tell you specifically that it's bad to hoard illiquid assets at times. That's why the economy gets more efficient. They don't respond to that, so they don't get anything off of that. And second, on the decrease in foreign investment, first of all, they just say that if you have a decrease in assets, you're going to see a decrease in foreign investment. So I tell you, if you have an increase in assets, increase in economic productivity, you're going to have an increase in foreign investments. It's as simple as that. They just keep on talking about their impact. They never respond to the warranty because they don't understand it either. But then, let's move on to their contention side. You're going to look to a few key voting issues now. The first is this point about this deontological level. Because since we're weighing under structural oppression, we're looking to how we can mitigate these structures. And I tell you that hoarding money in and of itself is a structure. That's a clear way you can vote. But the second point is going to be about how we can help with labor taxes, help the wealthy, and help the unwealthy in all these ways. I tell you, because of this IRS report, none of their cards are actually applicable. That means you can extend and weigh everything in this round. We're looking to least well off. Labor taxes, morally raising those who are productive, all help the least well off. It's a really clear affirmative ballot. Thank you.